platform. And now we're ready to begin today's event, and it starts off with a learning session on the principle of neutrality. This series forms a part of PHAP's online learning series on humanitarian law and policy. For those of you who are PHAP members and are participating in the association's continuous learning credits program, please watch and listen for the numerical code afterwards, and I'll give you that so that you can use that code to access the assessment tool and earn your credit for the session. As you can see, we're 3/4 of the way through our series. We've already done humanity and impartiality, and now we are doing neutrality. Don't forget, though, that next Tuesday we do the 4th session, and that will be independence. So, the learning objectives for today. The first learning objective is understanding the core humanitarian principle of neutrality, both in its definition and in its implementation. The second learning objective would be to understand and just knowledge of the examples of practical implications of neutrality when you're trying to operationalize it on the ground. Third, understanding the challenges involved in translating neutrality into assistance and protection work, such as public advocacy, and I know that's going to be a topic that's going to come up today. And then finally, familiarity with the differing interpretations of neutrality within the humanitarian community. So first, for the brief learning session, to help us accomplish these objectives, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest expert for this presentation, Kate McIntosh. Kate is a Deputy Registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former, and it's a lot easier to say ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I want to be clear that Kate joins us today in her personal capacity and is not speaking in her official capacity as Deputy Registrar. Kate has 20 years of experience in international criminal justice and post-conflict interventions, as well as in the humanitarian policy and advocacy work. From 2003 to 2011, Kate worked with MSF, first as International Law Advisor and then Head of Humanitarian Affairs Department for the Operational Center in Amsterdam. And I should note that way back in the year 2000, Kate published an article called The Principles of Humanitarian Action in International Law, and it remains today to be one of the real seminal pieces on that issue, and that's why we've invited Kate here today. It's a great place to start the discussion on neutrality. Welcome, Kate, and over to you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. As you said, this is the third in the series of examinations of the fundamental principles of humanitarian action and the practical dilemmas around them. And today we're going to talk about neutrality. Now, I listened to Hugo Slim's wonderful talk on humanity, the first one in the session, just recently. And he mentioned that he was pleased to have been asked to discuss humanity because he said it was his favourite principle. Well, I think neutrality is actually my favourite principle, so I'm delighted to explore it with you here. It's my favourite because I believe it lies at the core of almost every dilemma facing humanitarian action today. I'll outline, and I got the Q mark briefly, what I think neutrality means as a principle of humanitarian action, and also a few of the key ways in which I think it's at stake for humanitarian actors today. We then have a great panel, and I'm also very much looking forward to interacting with, who will be able to take you right into the core of the current dilemmas that are facing humanitarianism. So, let's start with neutrality. Now, neutrality is, of course, one of the fundamental principles of the Red Cross movement. And these principles, as you will know, have also been adopted by the United Nations to cover its humanitarian work. And most humanitarian NGOs have also indicated their commitment to them. Just to put it into context, humanity is the fundamental principle. It's a belief in itself, and it explains the purpose, the motivation, and the rationale for humanitarian action. Impartiality operationalizes that principle of humanity. If every person is equally valuable, which is the core idea behind the principle of humanity, then they must be treated equally and in response to their individual needs. And that's where we get the principle of impartiality. Moving to neutrality, neutrality is a tool to make the first two possible. While humanity and impartiality focus on the individuals that are in need of assistance and protection, neutrality takes us into the context, at least the traditional context of humanitarian action, which is conflict. The concept of neutrality can only exist if there are two or more parties opposing each other. We're neutral not in regard to the victims, we're impartial in regard to the victims, we're neutral in regard to the conflict itself, or we're neutral between the parties to the conflict. So how is neutrality defined in the guiding texts? Aha, I see my slide has magically appeared. That was exactly the slide I was about to put up. Here we've got on the slide here, we've got the definition of neutrality as a fundamental principle of the Red Cross movement. I'll read it out. It's a short definition. It says that in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all, the movement, the Red Cross movement, may not take sides in hostilities or engage at any time in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. So I'd like to pull out three different aspects of this, which are the three parts that I've highlighted in bold there on the slide. So the first line basically explains the function of the principle. The function or the purpose of neutrality is to enjoy the confidence of all. And why do we want to enjoy the confidence of all? Well, so they'll let us in. Neutrality is all about access. Access and, of course, security. We're neutral, we're not involved in the conflict, so allow us in and, importantly, don't shoot at us. Moving ahead, the definition then has two prongs. Neutrality means not taking sides in hostilities and not engaging in controversies of a political, racial, religious or ideological nature. I'll start with that second one, engaging in controversies, and we could call this ideological neutrality. I think ideological neutrality, or not engaging in controversies, raises the issues which probably first come to mind when we think about dilemmas over humanitarian neutrality, namely the question of whether speaking out about atrocities witnessed in the course of humanitarian work compromises neutrality, and the associated question, of course, of how far advocacy and humanitarian protection work are likely to be tolerated by authorities. I think there are at least two classic approaches to this question, which I hope will be explored more in the discussion, so I'll just outline them here. The first one holds that speaking out does compromise neutrality, and for that reason, neutrality, which, as we've seen, in any event is not a goal in itself, but a means to an end, neutrality should not be a core principle of humanitarian action. So in this view, neutrality can mean complicity. We cannot be neutral in the face of atrocities. We cannot be neutral in the face of violations against the civilian population, for example. Now, when the Code of Conduct for the Red Cross movement and NGOs involved in disaster relief was drawn up in the late 1990s, this was a prevailing view, or at least a very popular view, and you'll notice that the word neutrality does not appear in that code anywhere for exactly that reason. And I hope we have some participants here, perhaps some organisations that held that position, or maybe even hold that position today. An alternative understanding, which I believe would be advanced by the Red Cross, for example, is that the framework of international humanitarian law is neutral in itself. Its aim to protect civilians is purely humanitarian, and when that's carried out impartially, this is by definition a neutral act. So if we are to speak out in order to ensure or to encourage respect for international humanitarian law, that is inherently a neutral act. And there's a fantastic quote from Jean Pictet, with whom many of you will be familiar. Jean Pictet is the scholar, the man who wrote the commentary to the Geneva Conventions, and he's difficult to put on a PowerPoint slide, actually, because he talks in extremely long and elaborate sentences. But nonetheless, I will, in a minute, put up a slide, a short extract of something he said about ideological neutrality. And that's this. He says, neutrality characterises the reserve which the Red Cross must maintain with regard to any doctrine except its own. In other words, if the Red Cross stands up for its own principles, which includes, of course, the protection of civilians, protection of non-combatants, etc., that cannot be seen as a violation of neutrality. And I'll return to this idea that action which is in itself humanitarian and impartial must be neutral later on in my presentation. Okay, returning to the definition, let's look at the first prong of that definition. Neutrality is also defined as not taking sides in hostilities. What does this mean? It's fairly obvious that a humanitarian organisation will lose its neutrality if it takes up arms in a conflict. So what else can this principle contain? I think to put some meat on this bone, we can look at the Geneva Conventions themselves. Now, the term neutrality is actually not used at all in relation to humanitarian organisations in the Geneva Conventions. However, if you read the articles that relate to humanitarian action in the conventions, it is clear that the type of humanitarian action envisaged there does not and should not affect the balance of power between the parties. And this, I believe, is how we should understand this first prong of the definition. Not taking sides in hostilities. I think we can refer to this as practical neutrality, as opposed to the ideological neutrality we just discussed. John Pictet's commentary again spells out that humanitarian organisations should not engage in any hostile acts against one side. Now, apart from taking up arms, one can also think of perhaps passing information to one party that might be military significant, for example, about troop movements that humanitarian organisations may have noticed while they were working and travelling in the field. To pass on that information to another actor could be seen as a hostile act and would be a violation of practical neutrality. Conversely, humanitarian operations should not have the effect of advantaging the military efforts or, interestingly, the economy of the party in whose territory they operate, and this appears in Geneva Convention number 4. This, I think, is interesting for organisations who bring valuable resources into a conflict zone, as many of us do, and it clearly brings up the issue of diversion by warring parties and the importance for humanitarian organisations of ensuring they exercise effective control over the resources brought into a conflict area. If resources are diverted and end up supporting military efforts or significantly advantaging the economy, that humanitarian operation is not neutral. And crucially, that means that the party in control of that territory is not obliged to permit access. So if we understand the prohibition on taking sides in hostilities in this broad way, I think, like many of these humanitarian principles, it makes instinctive sense. We understand that if we violate this kind of practical neutrality, we're likely to be denied access, or even to put ourselves physically at risk. We will have lost our privileged position as neutral actors, and we will in some sense have entered the conflict. I said I'd return to the idea discussed in terms of advocacy earlier. The action which is humanitarian and impartial is by definition neutral. I think this is a powerful and important idea, and it's supported by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, which, as most of you know, was established as part of the United Nations after World War II. And I hope you'll allow me just to discuss one judgment of the World Court, which is relevant here. So the International Court of Justice had a chance to pronounce itself on humanitarian principles and the definition of humanitarian assistance just over 30 years ago, in 1984, when the United States, which was at that time involved in a proxy war against Nicaragua, was called to the court by Nicaragua, who complained about a number of things, including the US funding of the armed opposition group in its territory at that time, the Contras. Now, Nicaragua alleged that the US was attacking it, or at least taking sides in hostilities against it. Look at the definition of neutrality for a humanitarian organisation. So Nicaragua alleged that the United States was taking sides in hostilities, at the very least, by funding, training and arming the Contra group. Now, what's interesting for us is the US defence. The US said, we're not taking sides in hostilities, we're providing humanitarian assistance. So the court had to examine whether the assistance which was being provided fit into the Red Cross definition of humanitarian and impartial, In other words, whether it fit the definition of being provided for the purposes of alleviating suffering and saving lives, and whether it was delivered in an impartial manner. They found that the assistance did not fit the definition, and therefore that the US had intervened illegally in the affairs of Nicaragua, that the acts of the US had not been neutral. Now, what's interesting for us is that they confirmed then that if that action had been humanitarian and impartial, it would, by definition, have been neutral. It would not have been seen as taking sides in the conflict. Remember that. I'd now like to just briefly introduce some contemporary dilemmas in the area of neutrality, and I'll just outline them. I'm hoping that many of you will have interesting current dilemmas and variations on these themes that we can discuss with the panel. But I'll just look at two, perhaps could be described as global trends, which have been going on for some time, but which continue to affect humanitarian organisations, and where neutrality is, I think, the critical issue at stake. The first one is the continuing trend to include humanitarian action as part of a coherent, joined-up response to conflict, which may also involve political, military, peacekeeping and development actions. This has been seen in settings around the world and in the doctrines of most of the major Western powers, whether identified as COIN or counterinsurgency strategy, the 3D or comprehensive approach, or even the integrated missions of the UN. The linking of humanitarian assistance to security goals has provoked suspicion about the neutral identity of the humanitarian sector. Now, we've seen some dramatic assertions of this point of view and perhaps even some consequences of this idea. As you heard at the outset, I used to work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and after 5 Médecins Sans Frontières staff were killed in Afghanistan back in 2004, a spokesman for the Taliban, whose involvement in the attack, by the way, was never established, nonetheless claimed responsibility for the murders and later stated that organisations, I'm quoting, like MSF, work for American interests. They're therefore targets and they would be at risk of further attacks. In a move which left hundreds of thousands of people without emergency assistance, as you know, Al-Shabaab expelled 16 humanitarian organisations from south-central Somalia in November 2011, only 4 months after famine was declared. An Al-Shabaab spokesman accused the organisations of, among other things, lacking complete detachment and neutrality with regard to the conflicting parties in Somalia. And 2 years later, an Al-Shabaab official was reported as saying, whether they call themselves humanitarian or not, we know who they are. They're the civilian face of the infidel forces. There are other examples. The point is the statements. There was a clear link between the actions of humanitarian organisations and Western intervention, and it seems fairly clear that this, to a certain extent at least, was caused by Western powers themselves using humanitarian action as part of their response to conflict overseas. So this perception that humanitarian organisations strayed beyond the framework of humanitarian action, lost their neutrality, broke the contract between warring parties and humanitarian organisations, is a worrying development, and one I think which continues to challenge humanitarian organisations in the field today. The second factor I wanted to touch upon, just briefly, where humanitarian neutrality is at stake, is counter-terrorism. Now, as many of you are aware, humanitarian operations in parts of the world where armed groups have been designated as terrorist are often hampered by laws aimed at preventing the financing of terrorist organisations. Now, if humanitarian resources were financing the military efforts of a warring party, designated terrorist or not, this would clearly be a violation of the practical neutrality that we've been discussing. And organisations have of their own accord introduced a range of internal control mechanisms to minimise risks of diversion, not only in these contexts, of course, but in any context, because the last thing a humanitarian organisation wants its precious and crucial resources to do is to be diverted from the people that actually need them, and to fuel the conflict by prolonging the war and financing parties. In the counter-terrorism framework, however, and in some more extreme cases, there are suggestions that humanitarian assistance itself to individuals associated with groups designated as terrorists should also be prohibited. In other words, that assistance to individuals designated terrorist would be a violation of neutrality. Just want to raise this because I think it's a very dangerous suggestion. And here I would like to bring up again the point I made earlier, which I think we can say is supported by the International Court of Justice. In other words, if aid is humanitarian and impartial, it cannot be seen as support to a party to the conflict, terrorist or otherwise, and it is, by definition, neutral. I think this equation, is crucial in defending humanitarian assistance and protection in the face of assaults on the legitimacy of humanitarian operations today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for that. It was a very clear presentation, and I think we've all learned quite a bit about neutrality, both in terms of what it really means, and I like the way you've broke apart, but also just the way it plays out in a couple of very, very difficult dilemmas that we in the humanitarian business are facing these days. Before we move on, we did receive some questions beforehand, and I want to ask you one because I think it's just kind of a point of clarification. Azra Durek has asked, it's not always possible to be neutral. And do you have guidelines? Are there actually guidelines for when there are exceptions to neutrality?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I think neutrality, like most of the is always going to be contested and somewhat exercise. I highlighted the two aspects where this might come up. One is the ideological neutrality, and I think there are probably always discussions about whether taking a position for or against a party to the conflict in some way fits within the framework of neutrality. And as I said, there are different views on that. I believe the Red Cross view and the Pictet would support is that where out is to defend, is to protect or defend the framework, then it's still neutral. Practically, however, though, it may still have negative obstacles, and it may be perceived as not being neutral. In terms of the other aspect, the more neutrality, I don't, but I think it's very interesting. I think that's something humanitarian organisations really do have to take seriously, and I believe most humanitarian organisations do. And diversion is an absolutely legitimate concern of warring parties, and one which allows them to deny access to humanitarian organisations. So humanitarian organisations have to develop robust internal, risk management systems which enable them to have and to show that they have good control over their resources. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah,
I suggested a guideline.
That's a really important point. But just to be clear, do you view neutrality more as kind of a sliding scale, black or white, yes or no thing? It's more to what degree is an organization neutral and working towards neutrality?
I think that's right. I think humanitarian organizations should try to avoid being caught up in conflict in any way, but they will be challenged, acts will be challenged as not being neutral anyway. So there should be an ongoing discussion about these issues.
Okay, two more points of clarification. We've heard in the discussion around humanity that even a military actor can act with humanity and can act with impartiality. Can militaries act with neutrality?
That's a great question. I guess it depends what kind of military. Are we talking about like a third military who's not involved in the conflict?
I guess I was thinking of parties to the conflict. Would they ever be able to act neutrally?
I don't think that would be a relevant concept for the parties to the conflict, no. I think it's really about an outside actor coming in and having absolutely no impact on the conflict. That would be the goal, to come in as a third party, have no impact. That's how you get in, that's how you would negotiate your access, that's how you would claim legitimacy. So I think it's really relevant to external parties.
Yeah, and there you're speaking, for instance, of peacekeepers.
Yeah, also.
Okay. Maybe one last point for clarification. You did mention that neutrality is a concept that's relevant in armed conflict. What about other places where humanitarians might be working, for instance, in a natural disaster situation?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would consider that neutrality is only relevant, it's a common sense point really, where there is a conflict, because as I said, you are neutral between two opposing parties. That's what the word means, right? Or between 2 points of view. However, just for accuracy's sake, I should maybe point out that the United Nations, the resolution, the 1991 resolution, which adopted the fundamental principles for all the humanitarian work of the United Nations, doesn't specify that that would only apply in armed conflict. And I suppose we can think of a polarized situation which might fall short of armed conflict when it would still be important, for example, perhaps in situations of gang violence or other sub-armed conflict situations where it would still be important not to be strongly associated with any particular party in the situation.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think what we should do now is move on to the next stage of this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. But basically, look, for those of you who are part of PHAP's series of online learning sessions on humanitarian law and policy, you're able to take part in a two-part assessment for your continuous learning credits. And once the assessments are live, you'll be notified via email. And here's the assessment code. It's 1389. Please note this down. In order to complete these assessments, you're going to need this code, 1389. Also, all of this, if you want to review these materials, there is a recording link, and everything we're doing here today, the discussion, the chat, the polls, all of those resources are available at the link you see on your screen before you. The recording will be processed within the next couple of hours, and it'll be posted up there later today. So now I would like to move forward with the second part of the day, our panel discussion on neutrality. Drawing on Kate's excellent presentation, we'll continue to examine the pragmatic side of the principle of impartiality, some of the issues she's already raised and maybe some others, in particular just trying to get at what are its operational implications. And with that in mind, let me introduce the rest of the panelists. Banu Altumbas is the director of International NGO Safety Organization in Democratic Republic of Congo. She's based in Goma. She has extensive experience in senior humanitarian positions in the Great Lakes region and the Balkans, including with MSF and ACF. Mark Cohen is a senior researcher at Oxfam America, currently working on humanitarian policy and climate change, as well as evaluations of humanitarian advocacy in Oxfam International's Rights in Crisis campaign. His academic training is in political science and development studies, and is also a part-time faculty member at Johns Hopkins University. And finally, Samir El-Houari is a deputy head of the OCHA Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa, Romania. Prior to joining OCHA, Samir was a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group, the Overseas Development Institute, where his research focused on humanitarian space, stabilization, and UN integration. Just before jumping to our panelists, though, and this is something we did last week, we thought it might be interesting to engage you in a very quick decision-making exercise. You'll see a poll come up now, and why don't you pretend you're the head of mission? What would you do in this circumstance? And there's the poll. So I'm going to read it. You are working in a country where there is an armed conflict between the government and a rebel group. The rebel group is particularly ruthless and are responsible for the vast majority of violations against the civilian population. In this case, solidarity with their victims is more important than maintaining neutrality. Do you agree or disagree? Again, you might think of a situation, for instance, even if you go back in time to World War II, Nazi Germany. Certainly one side doing some, committing atrocities against the civilian population, particularly the Holocaust. would you try and maintain your neutrality as an organization in order to be able to operate, let's say, inside Germany or even inside those concentration camps? Or would you perhaps view solidarity as more important in that kind of a situation? So far, it seems like the maintaining neutrality, the principled stand of neutrality, is so far quite quite favored in front of those who would move towards solidarity with the victims. Okay, maybe just to kick us off today, I'd like to start maybe going to you, Mark. One of the things about Oxfam is something that Kate has already mentioned, and that is that certain organizations have taken a different stand, have formalized a different interpretation of the principle of of neutrality. And I'm wondering, Mark, Oxfam is one of those organizations. Would you be able to just walk us through a little bit how Oxfam views neutrality and why they took that position?
Sure. Well, I would say that for us, um, we support the idea of not taking sides, and I was very interested in the equation that um, Kate offered us, because I would say we very much strive to provide impartial or provide humanitarian assistance in an impartial manner. So if that equals neutrality, then I would say we're all for that. But where we differ, and Kate also touched on this, is that we don't consider ourselves neutral with regard to human rights, accountability, and justice, and we carry out advocacy related to the causes of humanitarian emergencies, and we also reserve the right, if you will, to look at who's carrying out atrocities, who's causing the humanitarian emergency, and if there's a disproportionate blame, we don't think we should keep silent on that. Now, that's not engaging in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature, but we are willing to talk about why there's humanitarian need and what needs to be done to resolve it. And because we take a rights-based approach in our humanitarian and also development work, we feel that we often do need to speak out, and so in that sense, we would say we're not neutral, and I think we've pushed in the discussions around the core humanitarian standard to say that one can give impartial assistance, not take sides in the hostilities, but still can engage in advocacy on issues of accountability and justice.
Okay, I've got a comment here from Susan who says, Mark, solidarity with victims does not equate to taking sides in a conflict. Is that something you would support, or Oxfam would support?
Yes, I mean, I think we would say that speaking out about why there is a need for humanitarian assistance, speaking out for the civilians who are affected by conflict, that's part of our humanitarian mission. So I think very much we would agree with what Susan's saying.
Okay, I've got another one from Reza and Aman who says, can you explain how calling for active military protection of civilians is a breach of neutrality? So that sort of speaking out you're talking about. Let me give you an example, just to put you on the spot, Mark. In response to what was going on in Darfur, an enormous number of humanitarian organizations and others were very critical of the Sudanese government. I would think that that level of pointing the finger at the Sudanese government, of course, we did that. I was part of it. We did that in line with what we believe were violations, but I think also it has an impact on their ability to conduct the war, does it not? It makes it very, very difficult for them in the international arena. I would think in some ways it has that kind of an impact, that when you speak out about these violations, that it does involve, it does get you into the controversies there.
Absolutely, and I would even go further and say that organizations that very much sought to provide impartial assistance in Darfur, or Kate gave the example of Afghanistan and the Taliban, even when the action from the point of view of the humanitarians is neutral, the parties to the conflict may not perceive it that way, and as we used to say in the 1960s, perceptions are reality in politics. So many international humanitarian organizations were expelled from Darfur, including Oxfam. Great Britain, because of this perception, and the definition I've given of how Oxfam sees neutrality clearly isn't always perceived as neutrality by the armed parties. So advocacy about human rights may indeed preclude access to people in need, and it's a difficult situation, but
Yeah.
I think from our perspective, we feel that we do need to speak out.
Yeah. No, thank you, Mark. Thank you for that. Samir, I'd like to bring this issue that Mark has just raised, and Kate mentioned it as well, and that's the issue of perceptions. You know, there's neutrality in fact, and then there's the perception of neutrality, and obviously both of them will have an impact on access, on the confidence, on obtaining the confidence of the parties. And I'm wondering, Samir, if you can comment on this from the UN standpoint. I say that because, in particular, you know, the humanitarian arms of the UN, like OCHA and WFP and UNICEF, are also within an integrated framework, are, you might say, joined with the political and sometimes not neutral arm of the UN. And I'm just wondering if you might want to talk us through some of the ways in which the United Nations deals with that kind of a situation, where it is very, very difficult for humanitarians to separate themselves from the controversy, you might say.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and hi to everyone. Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent point, and I think on the issues of perceptions, I think they're key. I mean, I think, you know, the way that Kate spoke about, you know, the principle of neutrality in international humanitarian law is almost a deal between the humanitarian organizations and the parties to the conflict, and that is in exchange for non-interference, that is, following the principles of neutrality, these belligerents will allow humanitarian organizations to operate and respond to needs. So nothing should be taken for granted, and therefore you need to be able to create that space, and partly being able to create that space will rely on you and whether people perceive you to be as neutral, to be impartial, or as a humanitarian actor. So I think the issue of perception is central. Now, Kate and others have also mentioned the issue of the trend towards integrated missions or wider global kind of donor policies that try to bring together these comprehensive approaches. Now, just to speak a little bit about the UN integrated missions, I think
Samir, sorry, this is Marcus coming in here. Sorry, your volume is very low, so it's very difficult to hear you. If you could go to the adjust microphone volume on top of your screen and then put your volume up towards max and make sure you're speaking towards the microphone.
okay, is that better?
That's better, Samir. Thank you.
Okay, so no, so I think it's important just to take a step back to when discussing integrated missions, saying, okay, well, what are these missions and why are they taking place? And they're essentially an attempt at both the strategic and structural level to try to promote coherence between different parts of the UN in conflict and post-conflict settings. In other words, trying to make sure that the political, security, human rights, development, and humanitarian components of the UN are working towards complementary objectives and are also complementary of each other. Now, this essentially applies to all contexts in which there are UN country teams and peacekeeping or political missions. Now, the policy is quite clear that integration efforts should respect humanitarian principles, should protect humanitarian space, and should facilitate effective humanitarian coordination. So it recognizes that there is a distinction for humanitarian components of the UN in trying to respect and maintain its core humanitarian principles. Now, this is deemed problematic despite the policy kind of recognizing the distinction, because if we look at the way that the UN is carrying out its peacekeeping operations or the role of some of its political missions in some contexts, there has been a change from the kind of more impartial peacekeeper that is essentially monitoring a ceasefire between two sides in a neutral manner. But we're often seeing, and I think Banu might talk to this in the context of the DRC, is that the UN peacekeeping is obviously playing a peace enforcement role. We're also seeing political missions that are often supporting governments in highly polarized or contested contexts. And Kate mentioned, Somalia, Afghanistan, where, armed groups have kind of seen the UN as not playing a neutral role. So if you look at integration in these contexts, you're essentially seeing the UN as potentially taking sides in a conflict if it's fully integrated within a mission, and therefore compromising its neutrality. And I think NGOs have also raised concerns because since they are participating in UN-led coordination mechanisms, they essentially feel that affiliation and therefore the perception is of one where they're also potentially taking sides with the way that the UN's political or peacekeeping missions is operating in a context. So I think there's efforts within the UN to try to mitigate those concerns. Now, I spoke about integration at the strategic and structural level. So at the strategic level, those concerns should essentially be raised for humanitarians operating in that context. And therefore, at the structural level, integrated missions should take into account those concerns. So, and that's essentially in the policy that form should follow function. And there's various ways that the UN can try to do that at the structural level. So there's, for example, which is probably the most common, is what we call 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the mission, where you have a humanitarian leader. The humanitarian coordinator is also a resident coordinator and also the deputy special representative of the Secretary General. So is linked, therefore, to either the political or peacekeeping mission, but the OCHA office is separated from the actual mission. And there's other variations of that where you're completely detached from the mission in those extremely polarized contexts, or you're fully integrated in those contexts that are less contested and less polarized. Now, I think OCHA's role is partly to advocate that the structure of the mission does in fact take into account these concerns around humanitarian principles. But I think it's important to also recognize a limitation, and that limitation is that the UN is a member state organization. Humanitarian coordination is carried out under the auspices of General Assembly Resolution 46182, which also highlights the principle of sovereignty and sees humanitarian action as playing a support role to the national authorities. So that's always going to limit, to a certain extent, the way the UN can be neutral, and it can never necessarily play the same role as the International Committee of the Red Cross or an independent NGO. But I think, once again, if we go back to Kate's equation, the best way to overcome this limitation is essentially ensuring that the humanitarian response is impartial, that your decision-making is independent, that you are negotiating and engaging with all groups to the conflict to ensure that people understand, what's your role, how you're operating, and your adherence to impartiality, and also advocating on behalf of those affected. I mean, some of you have also spoken about, whether standing in solidarity with the affected population is necessarily a violation of neutrality. And I think that, to a certain extent, is a false dichotomy. And I would agree with Susan that if we are standing up for the international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, the way you might go about it might differ depending on the context. You might necessarily want to speak out publicly, but I think that doesn't necessarily contradict the principle of neutrality. So again, I think a key lesson there as well is to see the principles as a whole, but not just to see neutrality independently, but also to see how it's linked to the principles of humanity, impartiality, and independence.
No, that's a really good point there, Samir, and I'll repeat it because I've said it in each one of these sessions, and that is that we've broken down the 4 core principles, the core humanitarian principles, into 4 different sessions, but they work as an integrated whole, and they balance against one another, they support one another, and sometimes they come into tension with one another. Banu, Samir has mentioned a few things that I'd like to find out how you view that in the context where you are, and I think in particular the perceptions of the United Nations, where I believe the peacekeeping force there has taken on quite a non-neutral role in the context. And what does that mean for the NGOs that are there, and what does that mean for the United Nations, and how you approach that work between where NGOs are cooperating essentially with the UN?
Yeah, can you hear me now? First of all,
Yes, no, you sound good,
because I
Banu, and
had
welcome from
a
Goma.
few Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, there are a lot of complications since the peacekeeping mission started here in 2001. At certain point, it kind of died down. But at the beginning, there were a lot of blurring the lines between the mission's objectives and the humanitarians' objectives. It kind of it even became an activism by the NGO community in 2002, 2003 to change the colors of the cars in order to disassociate themselves from the cars of the UN. I think it was a little bit of a 50-50 success in that sense. But currently what we are experiencing is, again, bringing that issue back on the table because now the United Nations peacekeeping force has a very different mandate than anywhere else in the world, that they created in 2013 a force intervention brigade, which actually has a mandate of active combat. Therefore, the peacekeeping mission all of a sudden became a direct belligerent to the conflict. I mean, they get engaged in combat with the different armed groups along the side of the national army. So therefore, the lines again are becoming blurred, and the neutrality of the NGOs and trying to stay away from the peacekeeping mission becomes of importance once again, because once like if NGOs are seen in an escort with the peacekeeping mission, or they're seen as collaborating on humanitarian activity level, that creates a complete different perception in the eyes of the beneficiaries, but also in the eyes of the armed groups. A couple of years back, we did some research on the perception of the NGOs in the eyes of the armed groups, and that's one of the outcomes that we had from the armed groups, saying, well, if we would have seen you with the MONUSCO, then we would have considered your mission completely different. So it does have an impact, and it does change the perception of neutrality of the humanitarians on the ground.
Thank you. You've raised a really important point just now, and I want to make sure that I understood it. And that is that it's not just the perceptions of, let's say, the armed actors in the area, the militia groups in DRC, but it's also the communities and the beneficiaries, how they viewed humanitarian organizations based on their cooperation or not, and collaboration or not with the peacekeeping mission there.
Yeah, I mean, their perception is clearly less subtle than the armed groups, for sure. But there are certain areas where the populations were extremely upset with the inaction of the peacekeepers when they were attacked by various armed groups. And they were suffered from those attacks, or they needed to displace because of that. So there are mixed feelings among the populations about the peacekeeping missions' efficacy and their response to their needs. So in certain areas, I'm not going to say that it's an overall perception or opinion by the beneficiaries, but there are certain areas where there is a strong discontent about the peacekeeping missions' reaction to their needs. So in those places, I think the NGOs have to be double careful about how they position themselves and how they use the humanitarian principles in order to explain their actions.
Thank you, Banu. For those of you out there, there's a poll up there right now. We've been talking a little bit about the United Nations, and Samir gave quite an eloquent explanation of it. Maybe if people want to vote there, we'll come back to you, Samir, on that. But first, I'd like to go back to Kate. Kate, you've launched a great discussion here so far, and I'm wondering, what is your take in terms of how NGOs need to position themselves vis-a-vis a peacekeeping mission, for instance, as MONUSCO, the peacekeeping mission in Congo is?
I think it's a great example actually that Banu just gave about essentially the poor performance of MONUSCO. I mean, the failure of MONUSCO, as I understood it, was it MONUSCO then? Maybe it was the precursor of MONUSCO, but the failure of the peacekeeping operation to carry out its mandate, and how it was because of that it was actually problematic for NGOs to be associated with them. I mean, just like they're not performing well, they're ineffective. It wasn't so much that that an NGO would be seen as aligning with a party to the conflict, at least if I've understood properly. It was more that people were angry that the peacekeepers weren't doing what they were mandated to do. And I think that highlights, I mean, to answer your question, Mark, what should NGOs do? I mean, it so depends on the situation. You asked earlier for clarification whether neutrality applied outside of conflict situations. And I said, well, traditionally not. But the idea not to be too close to various actors, may be beneficial in many situations. And I think that was a great example. Although, of course, there is a conflict in DRC. It wasn't really a conflict-related reason. I mean, it wasn't because the NGOs would have been seen on one side, but because they would have been associated with an unpopular actor. And I think we can think of other examples of that as well. I mean, Haiti sprang to mind. I think MONUSCO also was, Haiti, I think, was generally agreed was not in the situation of armed conflict at the time of the disaster. But I think being associated with MONUSCO was problematic for organisations operating there, because MONUSCO didn't have a great reputation, and being associated with the government might have brought its own problems as well. So I would say that an organisation needs to analyse the situation, to think about how relevant neutrality is in that context. And it might either be relevant for the traditional reason that there's a conflict going on and that access will only be granted if the organisation is seen as quite separate from that conflict. Or it may be that there are other important parties who are resented by significant groups, perhaps the target population, who won't accept help from those actors if they're seen as being too close to the unpopular powers that be.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd just add to that even if you make an analysis now, it's very difficult to undo a collaboration or a cooperation if in the future if peacekeepers do something. So it's you can't predict what's going to happen and what the population might feel a year from now, even if in present time the peacekeepers are acting with relative neutrality.
Absolutely.
We've got a few people who have raised essentially the same question. We've got Stefan in Germany who asks, are humanitarian aid organizations increasingly losing acceptance due to a perceived lack of neutrality? And we've got Stefan in Germany. Stefan has asked that, and then Mohammed Niaz Ahmed Rislan in Sri Lanka, raises the issue, the country there, where during the very, very violent ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, there was basically an allegation against all NGOs that they supported either directly or indirectly the armed Tamil group, the LTTE. And in that kind of a context where there's a widespread perception for the lack of neutrality, then there's a loss of trust. And I'm just wondering, what do you feel is the trend and the trajectory of neutrality and the perception of neutrality today?
Is that a question to me, Mark?
Yeah. Sorry, Kate. That's
Yeah.
to you. Yes.
Yeah. No, because I'd be interested to hear what the others have to say about it. Well, I think that it brings up the two sort of major trends I mentioned at the beginning, that I introduced at the beginning, which we've heard more about from Samir in particular, about the integrated mission one. But I think in a way those are two sides of the same coin. I mean, I'm really interested in the way the first trend identified is a kind of rejection of humanitarian neutrality by, let's say, the enemies of the West, perhaps. And the second one is a focus on and a mistrust of neutrality by the West, effectively. And humanitarians are caught in the middle. And so there's mistrust from both. If we can divide the world into those two blocks, which is a bit of a rough approach, and there's mistrust on both sides. I think the neutrality, what's interesting to me is the way recently, and you see that in the counterterrorism dynamic, the neutrality of humanitarian organizations is being mistrusted by their traditional supporters and major funders in the West. So humanitarian organizations have been shocked to discover that they are not trusted anymore by their major humanitarian donors, that they're mistrusted. They're not seen as being capable of marshalling their own resources in those areas.
No, it's an interesting dynamic that you're raising. It harks back to George Bush and his statement of "you're either with us or against us," which of course does not leave much room in an operating conflict, in operating in a conflict situation for the humanitarian. I am interested in how others are going to take up this issue. So maybe Mark. How do you see it? Are humanitarian organizations sort of increasingly losing this acceptance? And as Kate rightly points out, a mistrust, almost a blanket mistrust, as being from one side, operators of the West, and then also being seen by some Western governments as potential way in which humanitarian aid is making its way towards organizations that they are labeling as terrorist groups.
Oh, I think that's very much a dilemma for humanitarian organizations. And on the one hand, it's not just the perception of, as Kate put it, the enemies of the West, but with the stabilization, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency agendas that influence the donor community, the Western sort of traditional OECD donors, humanitarian assistance and development assistance are regarded as part of the stabilization package aimed at winning hearts and minds, and that I think, no pun intended, does violence to the principle of neutrality when one is wittingly or unwittingly operating as an agent of that kind of agenda. At the same time, the donors are saying, well, you work with local partners, you hire local people. Are you vetting them to make sure they're not members of terrorist organizations? And so this creates really dual sets or multiple sets of pressures on the humanitarian organizations. And I think we're seeing this increasingly, and it's very much a problem.
No, I mean, do you believe that some of the key Western donors here are actually deliberately manipulating NGOs in order that they are not enjoying the confidence of, let's say, in a place like Afghanistan, not enjoying the confidence of the Taliban?
Well, I think very much so. There's pushing. Humanitarian aid is a tool of stabilization, of counterinsurgency. I think that's very much speaking. I mean, I'm based in the United States. I would say that has very much been the U.S. government's view.
Yes. So,
And
just,
one could speak of some other Western
yes.
governments as well.
Maybe moving on, Samir, how do you look at these kinds of situations where perhaps largely through funding, but also in terms of the provision of security, what you end up with, let's say in Afghanistan or Iraq, is that the large part of the international community, the international humanitarian response, is taking place in the territory controlled, let's say, by the Afghan government, Iraqi government, the Somali government, places like that. And what does that do to the perceptions? And how in the UN do you approach things in those kinds of contexts, where there really is quite an almost blanket a blanket accusation that humanitarians are on one side? Samir, you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear you now.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, no, I think that links back again to the question of, how neutrality is linked to impartiality. And if you are only operating in one side of the conflict, or only, providing assistance to certain groups, then that's going to impact your perception of neutrality. So I think, once again, it's about, ensuring to the extent possible that you are operating in an impartial manner. And that goes back to, very operational issues, to, the extent to which you're able to assess needs, the extent to which you're able to negotiate access to different parts of the country. And I think that also goes back to talking about the responsibilities of the parties to the conflict. I mean, I think we often talk about the principles a little bit as if they're a panacea to, to granting access and to be able to kind of fostering humanitarian space. And, whilst, some of those principles are ends in and of themselves, neutrality is an operational tool, as Kate mentioned in her introduction. And I think, though, that, those operational tools, work in the context in which the parties to the conflict are respecting, broader norms of, international humanitarian law, and to which they are willing to, allow and grant access to impartial, neutral, and humanitarian organizations. And I think if in many of these conflicts we are seeing parties to the conflict, and including sometimes national governments, that are unwilling to facilitate humanitarian access to parts of the countries that are either maybe controlled by other groups, or by populations which maybe they deem to be hostile. So I think that, yes, sometimes, you'll see that it's a challenge to operate in all areas of a country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's down to the lack of neutrality of a humanitarian organization. It's often because the parties to the conflict are, for political reasons, not allowing those humanitarian organizations to operate. So I think it's important to make that distinction, and also speak about the responsibilities of the belligerents to the conflict.
Thank you, Samir. Maybe I'm just going to stick with you for one question more, and that is, without going towards as far as solidarity, what about just cooperation? I mean, in many places where, for instance, an organization like MSF would work, you would be working, for instance, in a government hospital. You would be maybe supporting organizations would be supporting the school system, the water and sanitation system of a government, because of course it would be those governments that are responsible for that towards its people. How does that level of cooperation affect neutrality from your point of view? Because of course the United Nations, you spoke of sovereignty before, and of course the United Nations organizations have to have a direct relationship, a cooperative relationship with host governments.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that you can distinguish between, the government at the political level, and you can distinguish between the government at the technical level. So, for example, just to give you an example, in Yemen, one way of providing water and sanitation assistance to the affected population is essentially to provide fuel to water stations in order to be able to pump water. Now, is that a breach of neutrality? I wouldn't think so. I think working with, the National Water Corporation, is probably the most effective way that you can provide water and sanitation assistance to the population. And I don't think that necessarily means that you are taking sides in the conflict. So I think you can distinguish between the technical level and the political level. Now, the extent to which the political level can influence the technical level will vary across countries, and I think that's where it's important that you can't take a cookie cutter approach in each context, and you need to, each organization needs to determine whether that action in a particular context is going to impact their perception, impact their ability to be impartial, and hence their neutrality.
Thanks, Samir. Just to point out that in our poll of whether, given the UN's integrated framework, it's possible for the UN to be neutral, a large majority, 70%, seem to be saying no, and only 10% saying yes. And maybe we'll have time to address that a little bit later. On that same question of cooperation, Mark, when you and I were talking the other day, you mentioned about how in Syria, in that very, very polarized conflict, you're essentially cooperating with the government to provide water and sanitation. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, we are working with the Ministry of Water Resources because that's the only way we can work in the wash sector. And again, it doesn't mean we don't talk about the displacement of a huge percentage of Syrians, both internally and into the neighboring countries, and now even into Europe, or our concerns about attacks on civilians, sieges of cities, which are carried out not only by government forces but by other armed parties in this many-sided conflict. The point that Samir made about the technical arms of the government and the political arms, I mean, we very much would like to make that distinction, but recognizing, I would guess most civil servants in Syria are required to be Ba'ath Party members, so it often becomes difficult on the ground to separate those things out, as Samir himself very well knows.
Thank you, Mark. And I think what you just talked about is, okay, what do organizations do on the ground? And Banu, I'm going to come to you for that, because you work with quite a number of you've worked in an individual capacity with a number of organizations, but right now in your current role, you're really working with a number of organizations. And I guess looking at some of these issues, where organizations are cooperating and working with ministries, or also just delivering aid, what are some of the practical measures that organizations can take to help with this issue, to boost their neutrality and the perception of their neutrality?
Actually, just listening to Samir and Mark, I think we need to make the clarification on the differences in the types of conflicts. Like when we're talking about Syria or Iraq, we're talking about the government forces against an opposition group. Whereas in the DRC, we're talking about a government and about 50 plus armed groups operating within the same or very close territories with the areas where the government is in control. So the context is completely different. Where in areas like Syria, where you need to clearly state that neutrality, or you could be perceived as not neutral, here you might have to prove that in probably 50 different areas that you are actually neutral. So there is a difference, and I think that difference sometimes helps us here in the DRC to make that point less significant, maybe in the eyes of the armed groups or the government forces. Indeed, all the NGOs working in this context right now, which used to be different in the years 1998 through 2003, but now everyone is operating in this area, are registered with the government authorities. They have their MOUs with the different ministries in terms of their programming. But the perception of the government is completely different. They understand that we will be working in areas where some armed groups might be operational. That doesn't create the problem for us, I think, but I think the problem comes more out to control systems of the NGOs, thinking that if they would go to the areas where the armed groups are active, they would create a perception of being not neutral, which is kind of just the opposite, actually. But you know, there are those kind of self decisions by some of the NGOs, thinking that, you know, they need to stick to where they are because they signed the agreement with the government, and they need to stick to that area alone. I think here what we are able to do with these humanitarian principles in the DRC is to use it for our advantage, to have negotiated access, because DRC is one of the few conflicts that NGOs find themselves nowadays that is actually possible to negotiate that access with those armed groups. But not only the lip service of saying, you know, we're humanity, independence, neutrality, and impartiality, but with our action to show that actually we're sticking to those principles. And both going together would make the effect and allow the NGOs to have more access to areas where there are enormous needs of the populations, actually.
I mean, just following up on that, Banu, there's a question from Zeynep in Turkey for you, and just how do you think it works in terms of neutrality? What is the relationship between that and the safety and security of humanitarian workers in that context where you work?
Well, it's a very delicate line that you know, by not sticking to the humanitarian principles, actually NGOs can put themselves in unnecessary dangers. We gave the example of the relationship with the peacekeeping force, for example, at the beginning. Imagine that you're going into an area with an escort of the peacekeepers where an armed group is actually fighting against them. So if you're perceived as being part of that group, you will actually not only block yourself from that area, because they're going to find you as one of the opposing parties to their fight, but also you're going to create yourself additional risks of being attacked by being with the group who has active combat. So I think there's a strict line between the sticking to the humanitarian principles and keeping your teams safe and sound. I'm not going to say that it's 100% guarantee, especially in the case of Congo, but at least it does allow us to improve that kind of understanding and keep us aside. When we talk to armed groups, for example, in DRC, and many of them, there is a general understanding that they feel the NGOs are do-gooders. Meaning they understand that they come here to help their population. So there's a fairly good acceptance of the NGOs actually going into their area. But what we can actually make it difficult for ourselves by changing that perception with our actions, by being seen very close to the FARDC if they're fighting with the FARDC, by seeing very close to the peacekeepers when they're fighting with the peacekeepers. So I think there is a direct link with that and the safety of the humanitarians. I don't know if it answers the question.
No, it did, and I think we'll get some other takes on that. I just, given that you're in DRC, I'd point out that there's a poll up on the screen right now that seems to be saying that the NGOs are not sufficiently careful in maintaining their neutrality when there are peacekeeping operations on. Quite a number of people not sure, but still very few are saying yes to that. Kate, I'd like to go to you. First, there was a point that's maybe a very small but an interesting question in terms of legal definitions, and then secondly, I'd like to ask you a bigger question. The smaller one is, we had a question about, well, if you're really worried about diversion going to belligerents, what's the definition of a belligerent? Who is it that really you have to worry about in terms of diversion of aid? And then secondly, I'd like to hear your take, Kate, on the larger point that Samir is bringing in here about, you know, the respect for international humanitarian law and how that more generally interplays with the principles and the ability of NGOs and United Nations agencies to comply essentially and adhere to the principles.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Yeah, the question about belligerence, there's no clear legal definition of that. It's basically a warring party. So when we're talking about diversion of aid, we mean to belligerence, we mean, humanitarian organisations like the kind of organisations who are involved today are obviously targeting civilians with their humanitarian actions. So where the resources or the medical assistance or the protection work, whatever they're doing, where that's benefiting the efforts of a warring group, that would be considered supporting a belligerent. Diversion, I guess, is most normally seen as theft of resources, which are then used, for example, to feed soldiers or other larger resources which might be taken and used to fuel the warring efforts. So there's no really easy legal answer actually to what a belligerent is. In terms of diversion, it just means when resources that are supposed to be helping people who are outside the conflict go to actually support the conflict itself. But yeah, on the B question, thanks for that. I think I liked, Samir brought in the issue about differing degrees of respect for IHL and how the responsibilities of warring parties shouldn't be overlooked, which I think is really valuable. I did want to pull out one thing about neutrality though, which is, I think the sort of traditional framework of humanitarian action is a very pragmatic one. Right, it's pragmatic. That's one of the things I was trying to highlight in the introduction. Is it's not an arcane and complicated thing to understand. You're more likely to be allowed to operate somewhere if the people letting you in can trust that by being there, you're not going to advantage their enemies, right? And this is where the whole counterterrorism thing comes in, of course, because that is exactly what the counterterrorism framework does not do. Does not trust that the enemies, the so-called terrorists, will be advantaged, and so this framework has been set up to try and prevent aid being diverted to those groups. I think because it's such a basic, and simple formula, that neutrality is actually really relevant in most contexts, even where protection of civilians might not be very high on the agenda, and respect for IHL similarly. And I thought, for that reason, I think it's worth saying that it's worth looking at your actions in terms of neutrality and seeing if you really are being neutral in that sense in the area. I was thinking about an example with MSF, actually, Mark. I don't know if you remember, but it was when MSF was trying to negotiate to get back into the Vani, the north of Sri Lanka, that had previously been under LTTE control, which was still under LTTE control then. And I'm talking about mid-2000s, so before the assaults, the last assaults and so on. It was difficult to negotiate with the Sri Lankan authorities to be able to operate in Kilinochchi, in the hospital there. And we thought, with the teams, we thought about what arguments we could use with the authorities to persuade them. And we thought through the humanitarian principles and the principle of neutrality, and we basically realized that the concern of the Sri Lankan authorities was that the medical supplies that the MSF teams would be using, it was a surgical program that we were talking about at the time, were extremely valuable to LTTE fighters who might be using them for field hospitals, bush hospitals, might steal the resources and might use them, and the government saw that. That was their concern. That was actually the obstacle. And once we'd understood that obstacle, we were able to negotiate, taking that legitimate concern into account. Of course, the LTTE fighters do have a right to medical care, but MSF cannot bring resources into an area and not be responsible for where they're going. That's a legitimate concern of the authorities. And the solution that was found was that the authorities controlled the supply. So the authorities, MSF didn't bring the surgical supplies in, the authorities did. They provided them to the hospital where the MSF surgeons then worked. And the MSF surgeons would treat anybody, of course, including, they didn't ask whether they were members of the LTTE. And once we'd realised that that was the issue, we were able to get a result. So I suppose I'm saying that, neutrality is not some kind of aspirational, highfalutin idea that only organisations or governments or parties which respect humanitarian action will agree to. It's actually a very nuts and bolts practical way to think about access arguments.
Yeah, no, I think you made two really good points that I see, and that is first, just again, the practical aspect of trying to be neutral. It involves much more than just standing up and telling people, yeah, we're acting with neutrality. It really has to do with organizations putting in place the kind of control mechanisms that ensure that they are able to basically know where their aid is going. And I guess that's also true for impartiality. If you want your aid to go to those most in need, you have to have mechanisms in place to make sure it's going there. And that those two things would work together, no?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think, I think the organizations, humanitarian organizations that are most successful at defending themselves in the face of attacks on their legitimacy, in arguing for access, or even in defending their reputation, because it's been discussed a lot, as Mark said, I think perception is reality, not just in politics, but in humanitarianism, are those organizations that can demonstrate that they've got a really good handle on what's happening with their resources and their programs.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I have a question maybe that would go to you. It's from Ivan Lowell, and it is, well, if you're cooperating, we've been talking about cooperation that's lopsided. What about cooperation with very partial partners, but on both sides? Is that a way of being neutral?
Very partial partners on both sides. Oh, I see. I think it depends what the cooperation is. I think there are two issues there. One is the perception issue. That sounds to me that would be more of a solution to the perception issue. So concerned about cooperating with just one party because you'll be seen as not being neutral, right? In which case it may be strategic to cooperate with somebody on the other side to improve the perception of neutrality. That's a very valid, strategic consideration. In terms of the sort of practical neutrality, it depends what that cooperation is. I would think that nobody would be happy about somehow funding the war effort on both sides. I would have thought that the principle that your humanitarian activities should not actually be supporting the military efforts of either party was pretty absolute. And to do that, on both sides would not be an appropriate solution.
Okay, thank you for that. Samir, I'd like to come back to you maybe on more of the practical side of things. What are some of the measures? And Mark, I'm going to come to you, and Bano, to you maybe again for this. We've heard some discussions about negotiation, maybe about openly recognizing and being honest with parties about some of the challenges that are faced, about being open about cooperation, transparent about work, things like that. What do you see as some of the key first practical measures that organizations and agencies can take, but also what are some of the challenges with actually implementing them?
Sure. Well, I think that's key. On the issue of negotiation, I think, it comes against to the issue of perception, right? So if you don't have a direct dialogue with your main, stakeholders in a conflict, I think, it's very difficult to be able to ensure that those parties have a perception of you as an organization as one that you would like to portray. So, if you say that, yes, I'm impartial, yes, I'm neutral, but you don't have a dialogue and you don't have an ability to influence those stakeholders, they could be listening to other groups, they could be getting, other information, other rumors. They say that truth is the first casualty of war, and I think, if there is a lack of engagement, it's very difficult to be able to ensure that the perception you want of your organization is actually being seen by the different stakeholders. So I think the first thing is to ensure that you do have an open dialogue with the different groups. Now, this can be extremely challenging in some contexts, some because of the counterterrorism measures that Kate has been speaking about, which might mean that your ability to engage could be criminalized. And also because in some contexts you have a myriad of different armed groups, so it's hard to know who to engage with, how, and some armed groups do not want to engage, full stop. So I think that there's a lot of practical challenges, and I think what is required is significant investment and skilled investment in actual negotiations with these different groups. Now, whenever I've personally been engaged in some of these discussions, it's very clear that the different interlocutors always have certain perception about where you've delivered, how you've delivered, to whom, and I think it's important to be able to very clearly and carefully document, who are you providing assistance to, where, on what basis in terms of your needs assessment, but also at being very clear and transparent in terms of how you ensure that, there is limited diversion of humanitarian assistance, as this is an issue that generally comes up when engaging with most interlocutors. So I think it's, being very prepared for that, and in order to do that, it needs a lot of investment and a lot of time in carrying out humanitarian diplomacy. And I think to a large extent, a lot of humanitarian organizations don't necessarily have the resources or the capacities to invest in that kind of humanitarian diplomacy. And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed going forward if we are to promote in a stronger way a perception of the humanitarian organization being neutral and impartial.
Let me put you on the spot. I mean, do you receive training? You talked about skilled engagement, skilled negotiation. Do you receive training for that kind of thing in the UN?
I mean, limited training, to be honest. And that's something that we advocate very strongly, in that more organizations need to provide better training to their staff members. And I think there's a significant room for improvement in providing greater training in that regard. And just to say, sorry, that there's there's also limitations on just training, and I think a lot of it is also about experience and kind of being able to put that training into practice.
That's a good point. Banu, what about you? You work with a lot of NGOs down there. How would you view the skill level of NGOs in terms of this kind of engagement and negotiation around the principles?
Yeah, it's a little bit mixed. I think one of the things that I am experiencing lately, especially in the DRC context, is that the composition of the NGOs operating within the same conflict context. You do have development-oriented organizations, post-conflict ones, and the humanitarians and the emergency actors all at the same place. That creates a lot of confusion and also unclarity, if you will, about what principles should apply to who. So I think that's a little bit of a starting point of how a lot of NGOs are not actually putting a lot of internal efforts to increase that understanding and the capacity within their organizations. To be honest, as I said, this is one of the few places where you can do the negotiated access. But when we look at the landscape of the Eastern DRC, there are at least more than half of the NGOs working here who are not getting engaged at all in negotiations for having access. So I think the same things that Samir mentioned, I think a lot of the NGOs are concerned about their internal capacities. They're concerned about their skilled engagement in negotiations. And also one of the factors that I find over the years in the field myself, lack of understanding of the context and lack of understanding of the key players and the actors of that context, which doesn't allow, because you cannot make it fit it all. Whatever I apply as negotiations in DRC, when I was in Darfur, it didn't work. I needed to find other ways to go around that to make it happen. So I think there is a lot of lack of that initiatives within the NGO community that, and also to make it a little bit more a worse matter, there are so many needs everywhere in the context of DRC, especially Eastern DRC, that there are a lot of NGOs who can do work in areas where they don't need to do that negotiated access or to apply those principles rigorously.
Thanks. I know that when we were talking the other day, you mentioned that the other factor that you seem to run into in the DRC is that the armed actors themselves don't understand the principles and don't understand what it means that NGOs are impartial or neutral, and that there's quite a bit of dissemination that needs to go on in that regard.
True. I mean, they do understand, actually, to give them a little bit of credit, they do understand the basic principles, but their interpretation of some of the principles are erroneous. And they might just mix the neutrality with the impartiality, or they might perceive like, also there is delicate matters in the conflict situation of DRC that you do have some of the armed groups specifically associated with certain ethnicities, and I guess that's the reason why sometimes they do make those confusions among the principles. But it is true. I mean, there is a basic understanding in most, well, I can't say that all of the armed groups, but generally speaking, but their understanding is different, and sometimes that understanding is also clouded by the perceptions that they create because of the actions of the NGOs on the ground, and which is true. I mean, it does require a firm engagement, a good strategy from the beginning by the NGO itself to say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to achieve it, these are the steps that we need to be patient about, and we need to go through the phases to ensure that we will not only risk our programs or our people, but also in the end we will be able to get there to the places where we want to have the access. And I think it's a long process when you consider it as phases, and I think a lot of the times NGOs either unconsciously are not putting the effort into that area of strategy to ensure that they will be able to execute it. Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know.
No, thank you for that. You did. No, it wasn't a question with a single answer or a formula. Mark, maybe just to you now, Mark. I'm curious, what's Oxfam's approach to, you know, what do Oxfam teams do and discuss in their management teams in terms of being able to, you know, guarantee, safeguard their neutrality? How are the skill sets, negotiations, negotiating skills, things like that treated? Is that something that you actively promote, or is it really just, you know, people gain experience and they get better at it?
No, I think it's something we're very conscious of. I mean, I guess I'd answer that as both and. You know, we tend to have people with a fair amount of experience leading the teams, but I mean, it is something we're very conscious of, and you know, in practical on the ground situations. I mean, so Oxfam America is we are now working in Darfur, basically having taken over some of the programs of our UK colleagues after they were expelled. And I mean, that means, you know, all of our employees and to some extent our local partners are vetted by the Humanitarian Affairs Commission of the government of Sudan. So what kind of perceptions does that create on the part of the government's opponents? You know, so I think our ability to operate is constrained unless we have people who can engage in those delicate and fraught negotiations. So it is something we emphasize a lot, and likewise, not only Oxfam, but when humanitarian organizations in general are engaged in cross-border operations, it's the other way around. So you may be engaged in negotiations with the armed opponents, and the government then may perceive that as you're really helping those folks. So this is something we have to deal with, and as I said, we tend to put people who have gained a lot of experience, and I mean, as Banu was saying, so she worked in Darfur, now she's working in DRC. I mean, so we have people who have been in a conflict situation and then moved to another one. Let me say something, if I may, also on the question of diversion. I mean, I think that's a very difficult situation. You know, if I'm out in the field moving humanitarian material, food or medicine or whatever it might be, okay, I've got the Geneva Conventions, the core humanitarian standard, the code of conduct, the sphere standards, those are all in my back pocket. But when somebody points a gun at my head, I mean, I can waive those documents, but that might lead to the trigger being pulled. So it's a very difficult situation. And then once that diversion occurs, are you then engaged in the hostilities? And whether there's some objective standard or not, what does the other side think? So these are not easy situations. And I mean, we face them in practical terms every day.
Yeah, no, you've raised two things. One is that diversion issue, but there's also what you were talking about in terms of working cross-border, where at that point a government might deem that you are not neutral, that that is a hostile act.
Absolutely.
And that sounds a bit like what Kate mentioned in the very, very beginning, where anti-terrorist legislation essentially does the same thing. It inhibits the ability of a humanitarian actor to even negotiate with a warring party because it deems that a non-neutral act. Kate, maybe back to you just on what Mark just raised about diversion. I mean, you know, if somebody robs you, you know, there's not much you can do about it. What maybe you want to put some how you would view the responsibilities of organizations in terms of preventing diversion, and what is it you're talking about? Because I assume you're not talking about you know, opposing a robbery of some kind or arming humanitarians so that they can protect their goods.
No, I wasn't. It's interesting. I mean, yeah, of course, if there's an armed robbery, there's an armed robbery. You know, there might be some obligation to report that, though. I mean, that would probably be the way I would think a humanitarian organisation would fulfil its obligations. And I guess if that's a repeated occurrence, I mean, the humanitarian organisation itself, I would expect, would see that as a security problem and might eventually have to stop operating in that area. I mean, I think these are all real life things that happen, of course, on the ground. I mean, interestingly, you talked about whether an armed, you know, you assume I'm not suggesting that there be an armed escort, and I'm not. But if you look at the framework of the Geneva Conventions, actually, there is what's called a right of control to the party that's permitting the humanitarian action. So because the Geneva Conventions are for international conflict, they tend to envisage, you know, one state letting something pass through to another state. And of course, most of the situations we're talking about are non-international conflicts. But the way it's envisaged is that a state, you know, one party has to allow civilians of another party to receive aid. But that party has what's called a right of control, which means if they think there's some risk of diversion, they can impose criteria to make sure that that doesn't happen, to make sure that those resources are not diverted to their enemy fighters, which is quite interesting actually in this kind of scenario Mark is describing. I mean, you know, you basically, if a humanitarian organisation is really unable to ensure the security and let's say the integrity of its operations, unable to ensure that it gets to the party, of course they're not obliged to risk their lives or put up some kind of a fight, but they might be obliged to report it to the other side, who could then perhaps think about you know, some kind of measures that they might want to undertake. It's it's an interesting issue. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but how do you view diversion when, for instance, is it diversion, for instance, when a rebel group, for instance, taxes humanitarian actors and asks for registration fees, as some of the, when they perhaps like the SPLA in the old days were more organized. Or, for instance, I was in northern Congo not too many years ago, and the local warlord was taxing the salaries of the staff, humanitarian staff in the area, and there were people saying that that was essentially allowing them to have a bit of a war chest, that money was going into those groups. How do you approach that? Is that diversion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that depends what is happening to that money, I think. I mean, if you look at the Geneva Conventions, they have a very interesting way of wording it. It's worded in terms of what a party must allow. So you have to allow the relief unless there are serious reasons for fearing that it will be diverted and that a definite advantage will accrue to the military efforts. So a definite advantage, not just a little bit of an advantage, but a definite advantage to the military efforts or to the economy of the enemy. So some kind of negligible, I mean, is that warlord actually running some kind of administration? I don't know if we look at the South Sudan example. I mean, does it make sense at all that there would be a tax? Is it an authority that controls territory, that provides some services? Then it's unlikely that that tax is, making a definite advantage to the economy or the military efforts. If it's pretty obvious that that money isn't going anywhere except towards buying arms, then I would say that is diversion.
Yeah, and of course there is also the issue of perceptions. My memory of it was a very rural area of Congo, and the militia groups, I'm not so sure if it would have been very possible to convince them on the difference between definite advantage and just an advantage. I think they were just unhappy with the taxes going that way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Samir, I'd like to come to you with a couple of questions that are overlapping from some participants. One is from Geneva, who suggests that, if humanitarian aid remains neutral, then it involuntarily helps sustain the conflict because it's not challenging the root causes of the war and the problem. And another one from Azra in Canada kind of chimes in on the same note, that neutrality of NGOs is good for a short period of time, but if it's prolonged, then it actually becomes an obstacle to resolution of the conflict. How do you view that kind of thing, especially within sort of a UN framework where also the UN is trying to reach peace and resolution of the conflict?
Thanks, Mark, and I think it's an important question, and I think a lot of it kind of depends on your take of what humanitarian action is and what are the boundaries of humanitarian action. Now, if you take a more limited view of what humanitarian action is that it is in fact a limited project that aims to alleviate the suffering of the population and save lives. And it's not there to address the root causes of people's suffering, which is deemed to be more of a political project, and one that maybe political security or development actors might be more engaged in. And therefore, it would be perhaps unfair to criticize humanitarian action for prolonging conflicts rather than point your fingers at the political efforts or the development efforts that should be trying to bring a resolution to the conflict, address the root causes, etc. Now, the reality is that a lot of humanitarian organizations have a broader mandate in which they not only engage in humanitarian activities, but also do development work and try to address the root causes. And I think there the issue of neutrality becomes more problematic, because you essentially are trying, if you inevitably try to address the root causes of a conflict or of people suffering, often that means, maybe perhaps taking sides. It means addressing power imbalances in a particular society. So I think that your ability to maintain your neutrality is a lot more difficult. So I think that that's choices that humanitarian organizations need to make. But I think that being quite clear and honest about what you're trying to do in a society, I think, is key. And I think one of the challenges is where a humanitarian organization, pronounces its neutrality, but then does engage in work which tries to address the root causes, but it might mean that in practice they are perhaps taking sides or taking, or being involved in actions that might favor certain groups over others. So I think being a bit clearer about what your mandate is in that case is key. But to say that neutrality prolongs conflicts, I think would be unfair to the humanitarian organizations that recognize their limited role.
Yeah, no, I think it's almost it can be a bit dangerous if one expects humanitarian action one way or the other to put an end to conflict. There's a difference. I always found it very difficult to explain to people that yeah, humanitarians aren't pro-war, but they aren't trying to end war. That limited role of the humanitarian is to basically make sure that people are able to survive things like war and conflict by delivering aid and assistance. Mark, I'd like to come to you with a question. I know that Oxfam works with partner organizations and talking quite a bit about the perspective of large international NGOs in terms of neutrality, but do you have a sense from working with partner organizations of the particular issues that they face? And what I mean is national NGOs that are in some ways part of a context or certainly more attached to a given context than an international. And just maybe one sub-question of that comes from Oscar in Gibraltar, and that is whether churches at the local level can ever be seen as neutral in a given conflict situation.
Well, to take the second part first, I imagine churches would say they're definitely not neutral vis-a-vis the Gospels, and and I mean that seriously, so that would in fact shape how they engage in humanitarian action. I mean, it's from a religious perspective that may be in serious tension with neutrality, depending on the particular action. And I'm speaking of local churches, local church organizations, not any denomination internationally. But to take the first question, I mean, our local partners and to some extent, this could be said of our local staff working for Oxfam in these types of situations we've been talking about. I mean, people are also citizens, they're parts of communities, so they frequently are very much affected by the situation going on, undoubtedly have, as individuals, opinions and perhaps very strong opinions, and as Banu mentioned, often the conflicts have an ethnic character, or even if they don't have an ethnic character, leaders and spoilers on various sides may manipulate ethnic groups against one another, and so I think that enters into it as well. What we try and do, and this has come up already, but certainly in Somalia, we work with a broad range of partners, so that even if our partners are partial in their action, if there's enough of them that begins to approach impartiality, not speaking of neutrality here, but nevertheless, I would say the local partners, and this is certainly a problem for international NGOs that engage in partnerships. They're much more subject to the local political pressures and the elements of the conflict, and so their ability to remain neutral, remain unengaged in the hostilities or controversies is very much the conflict itself will impinge on them. And I suppose one could say that by having a partnership with an international organization, and I think I'm starting to sound more like MSF than Oxfam here, but anyway, I think there is some cover being provided there because the international NGOs are tending to say we take no stance in these controversies, and so there's an element of cover provided by that partnership oftentimes.
No, thank you for that. Maybe Banu, over to you with that same question. Do you see particular issues that arise for national NGOs and community groups and things like that in trying to deliver humanitarian assistance?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more difficult for them to raise that principle explicitly and keep it because they're from that community, and they're from that ethnic group, and they're from that area. And most of the time, a lot of these NGOs also have contacts, not necessarily like social contacts, but family relation contacts with the armed groups. So I think it becomes much more difficult for the national NGOs to keep that principle intact, in my opinion. I haven't seen any of those national NGOs actually to prove that excessively over the years, especially in DRC. But having said that, I'm not sure if the armed groups are perceiving those national NGOs in that regard as they're perceiving the international ones. So yeah, I think it's an issue because that definitely hampers their ability to reach out other areas where they might be useful and helpful to the communities. But what I see in the context of the Eastern DRC, a lot of these national NGOs stay very local in the areas where they founded the organization and where they continue their operations, and they're not actually seeking actively to go beyond where they are to ensure that they would be able to equally serve the populations elsewhere. So yeah, it's an issue I can see, but not necessarily a practical issue on the ground for the time being.
Thank you for that, Banu. Maybe just point out that on the screen we've got a poll going. I don't know if a few people want to contribute to that more, but basically what should the scope of humanitarian action should be? Just stick with the limited goal of alleviating suffering and saving lives, or should humanitarians really try and address the root causes, even at the expense of neutrality? Kate, I'd like to come back to you, and just from a sort of a formal humanitarian law perspective, are there any different obligations or any different looking at neutrality for the perspective and how it might apply to national NGOs trying to deliver humanitarian assistance? We certainly know that over the next 10 years, there's going to be, I think we will see quite a bit more growth of national NGOs in terms of delivering assistance. Many in the Western NGO environments say, well, that's only going to work in in natural disasters, not in conflict settings, because they can't be neutral. And I wouldn't think that there's any reason why they can't be neutral, although the perceptions is maybe a different matter. Kate, maybe over to you on that one.
Yes, I mean, speaking from the, as you said, for the formal legal perspective, no, I think the principle is exactly the same for national NGO. As you know, the fundamental principles are the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which means it includes all the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world who are implementing the principle of neutrality in their work. So there's absolutely no formal reason why it should be any different for a national NGO. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind, of course, the national NGO will be more dependent on the host government. But humanitarian action is envisaged as something which is negotiated with the territorial state. So they're not formally in a different position in that respect either, although they may be less powerful. So yeah, no, formally the principle of neutrality applies equally to national NGOs, and they should be equally able to implement it.
Okay, thank you. As people can see, we're drawing to the end of our 2-hour session. What I'd like to do is go one more time around to everybody and just get really a 30-second take. What do you feel is probably the most difficult challenge right now being faced by NGOs in terms of, and I mean NGOs and the agencies, in terms of delivering on the principle of neutrality, of actualizing it in their activities. I'm going to start with Mark, and then Samir, and then Banu, and then finally with Kate. Mark, 30 seconds on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, I think for Oxfam, we are a multi-mandate agency, so we're engaged not only in humanitarian programs, but in development work and advocacy as well. And in order to do that, as I said at the beginning, we don't consider ourselves neutral as to the causes, as to disproportionate violence or responsibility for atrocities, as to accountability. So I think that often may create perceptions that we're not neutral, even though we are neutral with regard to the hostilities and the controversies of a political, religious, or ideological nature. So in order to be true to our rights-based perspective, we may be tarred with the brush of lack of neutrality. And I think being a multi-mandate organization, as we are, does create some dilemmas in that regard, in contrast to organizations that only engage in humanitarian action, such as MSF or the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Samir, you're the 30-second, and that would not be the American take on 30 seconds. Maybe the Egyptian take on 30 seconds there.
There we go.
Okay, sure. Okay, just two things. I mean, I think one thing is to say that, your humanitarian action essentially and your perception of neutrality has to be earned. And I think that we can't take it as a given by simply saying that you're neutral, that people will perceive you to be neutral. And I think humanitarian organizations need to do a lot of work in terms of outreach and engagement with different stakeholders, including the affected populations, for them to basically perceive them and agree that they are neutral entities. And then just to make sure that also, even if you are able to perceive yourself as a neutral humanitarian organization, a lot of it depends on also the belligerents in a party and how they, in the conflict, and how they essentially are willing to provide access, the way that they apply international humanitarian law, agree to humanitarian norms, because if that is limited, then even if a humanitarian organization is neutral, they're probably going to be limited in terms of what they can do in terms of access and in terms of ensuring the security of their staff. So to make sure that the balance in a way lies on both sides.
All right, thank you for that. Banu, how about you?
Okay, well, I think if we want to stay as compassionate humanitarians who come into a conflict situation to help the most vulnerable and the suffering population, to alleviate their sufferings and to save lives, that means we need to cross the front lines. And if we want to cross those front lines, we need to get the humanitarian principles back on the table and put the emphasis on that. Because without having that neutrality and the impartiality, we will not be able to reach the most vulnerable, to save the lives and alleviate the suffering. I think I even did less than 30 seconds.
Yeah, which is quite amazing. And Kate, how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not working in a humanitarian organisation now, so the others have perhaps a better take on the immediate problems. But I would say that both of these issues, both of these challenges to neutrality, the one that sees humanitarians as part of a Western stabilisation agenda, and the one which sees humanitarians as somehow fueling terrorist groups so-called terrorist groups. And my message would be take both of those seriously. Neutrality is a real issue. I think humanitarian organisations need to really think about whether they are part of a Western stabilisation agenda, willingly or unwillingly, and also whether they are, their resources could be being diverted and supporting warring groups. So I think those are real issues, and I would support what Samir said, that it's not about just saying you're neutral, it's about really looking at the impact of your operations.
Thank you, Kate. And look, as in previous weeks, I'm not going to try and wrap up this very, very interesting discussion. I will just say that I think with neutrality, we've seen it in fact, to a greater extent than with humanity and impartiality, the very, very important role played by the perception, and that, as Samir just said, that because of the perceptions, it requires the hard work of humanitarians to get out there and earn that sort of the neutrality that allows them to have the confidence of both sides, and that there's a hard work side to that, and that is the hard work of negotiating and getting out there and talking to parties. And I think the other side of it is that there's an investment. There's an investment to be made in the independence of an organization, in terms of its finances, in terms of its skills, and in terms of its ability to mount aid programs. Because the actions in the end that are going to be seen by the belligerent parties in a context and by the people and the beneficiaries are the actions of the organization. And I think that highlights the role played by independence as a tool to give real meaning to all of these principles. And that's what we're going to be talking about on Tuesday. So that was a bit of a plug for next Tuesday. With that, I'm going to end the discussion. It will, I note, as I said in the beginning, that there will be a recording of this. It will be placed up within a few hours, and you can see the link for that on your screen right now. If you've missed the very interesting discussions that we've already had on humanity and impartiality, or if you've got colleagues in your organization that have missed them, I'd really suggest that people tune into these, and you can see the links there. The next session, as I've said on a number of occasions, is going to deal with the topic of independence, and that's on October 6th. That's next Tuesday, October 6th, in this same time slot. And I think it's absolutely vital that we understand the extent and look at the extent and have an interesting discussion around without that independence. And you've heard it today. If, for instance, if you're solely funded by Western belligerent parties in certain crises in the world, you're going to be viewed as part of that Western belligerence. Or if you don't have the independent skills and the ability to go out and negotiate, it's going to be very, very difficult to maintain neutrality. Finally, after discussing the practical dilemmas of the core humanitarian principles in this series, PHAP, we are very happy to announce and offer an opportunity to look further at the principles and daily operations together with the Norwegian Refugee Council and Handicap International. The date for that is on October 8th, and in short, what NRC and Handicap have done is commission field research on the very topics that we're talking about in this series. So with the title of Principles and Pragmatism in Conflict Settings, Perspectives from the Field, what they have done is sent teams of experts into Colombia, South Sudan, Nepal, and Turkey, and for Turkey it was to study the situation in Syria, in order to explore how in those different contexts these challenges and influence of the principles arise. So please come. They're going to give a briefing on their initial findings, and the potential recommendations will be presented and discussed together with you, so don't miss it. That brings me to the end, and really a big round of applause, I think, for our speakers today, to Banu, to Mark, to Samir, and especially to Kate, who also put together that very, very clear and just an excellent presentation on neutrality. And of course, thanks to all of you for your participation. Best of luck to everyone in their work, and hope to see you next time. Good day.